Before we begin this story of hunger, desperation, and the moment everything changes, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to Alpha Reversed, and drop a comment telling me what you think will happen next. Because trust me, you won't see this coming. The rain fell like shattered glass against the cobblestones of the merchant district. Each drop a tiny explosion of cold that soaked through Alara's threadbare coat and into her bones, and she pressed herself deeper into the shadows between the dumpsters behind Thornwild's, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, where alphas in tailored suits dined on courses that cost more than she'd earned in her entire life. Her stomach twisted with a hunger so profound it had moved beyond pain into a hollow, echoing emptiness that made her hands shake and her vision blur at the edges. And she knew, with the clarity of someone who had nothing left to lose, that tonight she would either eat or she would die. The Omega Registry had revoked her housing voucher 3 weeks ago after she'd missed her mandatory presentation at the fertility center, claiming she was willfully avoiding her civic duty to bear children for worthy alphas. Never mind that no alpha had ever looked at her twice, that she was too thin, too plain, too broken by a childhood in the state homes where Omegas without family were raised like livestock. She'd been sleeping in doorways, eating from trash bins, watching her reflection in shop windows fade day by day until she barely recognized the hollow-eyed ghost staring back. And tonight, crouched behind this temple of culinary excess, she'd made a decision that would either save her or damn her completely. Through the kitchen's back window, she could see the organized chaos of the dinner service, sous chefs in pristine whites moving with balletic precision, steam rising from copper pots, the head chef shouting orders in a voice that carried authority and something else. Something that made every person in that kitchen move faster, sharper, better. She didn't know his name. This alpha who commanded his domain with the same intensity other alphas reserved for boardrooms or battlefields. But she'd watched him for 3 nights now, studying the patterns, learning that the kitchen staff took their break at 9:15, that the back door was propped open for ventilation during the dinner rush, that there was a moment, just a moment, when no one was watching. 9:14. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she rose from her crouch, every muscle protesting the movement. Her body so depleted, it felt like she was moving through water, thick and resistant. The kitchen door stood open like an invitation or a trap, yellow light spilling out onto the wet pavement. And she could smell everything: roasted garlic and fresh herbs, butter and wine, bread that had been baked hours ago and still carried the warmth of the oven in its crust. Her mouth flooded with saliva, her body responding to the promise of food with a desperation that overrode every survival instinct, screaming at her to run, to hide, to remember her place. She was Omega, she was nothing, she was invisible, and she used that invisibility now like a cloak as she slipped through the door and into the steam-filled chaos of the kitchen. Moving along the wall where shadows pooled deepest, her bare feet silent on the tile floor. No one looked at her, no one saw her, because why would they see an Omega when there was work to be done, orders to fill, perfection to achieve? She grabbed a loaf of bread from a cooling rack, stuffed it inside her coat with hands that trembled so badly she nearly dropped it, then reached for a container of what looked like beef stew still warm from the stove. The container was heavier than she'd expected, and as she pulled it toward her chest, her weakened grip failed, it slipped, tilted, and she caught it with her other hand, but not before a ladle clattered to the floor with a sound like a gunshot in the busy kitchen. Every head turned, every eye found her, and in that moment of frozen horror, she met the gaze of the alpha chef, Killian Thornwild. Though she didn't know his name yet, only knew the ice-gray eyes that locked onto her with the precision of a predator spotting prey, the sharp angles of his face that would have been beautiful if they weren't currently arranged in an expression of absolute fury. He was taller than she'd realized, broader, and when he moved toward her, the kitchen staff parted like water before a ship's bow. And she knew, with the certainty of someone who had lived her entire life at the mercy of alphas, that she had made a terrible mistake. "Put it down," he said, and his voice was low, controlled, the kind of quiet that was infinitely more dangerous than shouting. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stand there with stolen food clutched against her chest like it could shield her from what was coming. His scent hit her then, cedar and black pepper, smoke and something else. something that made her omega biology sing with recognition even as her mind screamed at her to run. And she realized he was close enough to touch her now, close enough that she could see the muscles in his jaw working, the way his hands had curled into fists at his sides. I said, "Put it down." She shook her head, a tiny defiant movement that surprised them both, and heard herself say in a voice that came out as barely more than a whisper, "I'm hungry." 2 words, simple and devastating. And she watched something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. Or something she couldn't name because no alpha had ever looked at her long enough for her to learn how to read their expressions. He didn't grab her, didn't call the police, didn't do any of the things she'd expected. Instead, he reached out slowly, carefully, and lifted the container from her trembling hands, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment, and even through her fear and hunger, she felt the shock of that contact like electricity. "When did you last eat?" he asked, and the question was so unexpected, so devoid of the anger or disgust she'd been bracing for, that she couldn't answer, could only stare at him with eyes that burned with tears she refused to let fall. He studied her face with an intensity that made her want to look away but couldn't, taking in the hollows beneath her cheekbones, the bruised shadows under her eyes, the way her coat hung on a frame that had once been curved and soft but was now all angles and bone. "Marcus!" he called without looking away from her, and one of the sous chefs appeared at his elbow. "Clear Station 3, and bring me—" He paused, his gaze still locked on hers. "Bring me everything." Marcus hesitated only a moment before nodding and disappearing back into the organized chaos of the dinner service, and Killian gestured toward a stool near the prep station. "Sit before you fall down." She obeyed because her legs were shaking too badly to support her much longer, sinking onto the stool with a relief so profound it was almost painful. And she watched with a kind of detached confusion as this alpha, this powerful man whose restaurant she'd just tried to rob, began to cook for her, not plating leftovers, not scraping together scraps, but actually cooking, his hands moving with the same precision and artistry she'd witnessed through the window, reaching for ingredients without looking because he knew his kitchen the way she knew hunger, intimately and without question. The kitchen staff had returned to their work, but she could feel their glances, curious and cautious, could sense the questions they weren't asking because their alpha had claimed this moment, this space, and no one would dare intrude. Killian worked in silence, his jaw tight, his movements controlled, and she watched the tension in his shoulders, the way he gripped the knife handle just a little too hard, as if cooking for her was taking every ounce of his considerable control. When he finally placed the plate in front of her, she couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare at the food that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. Perfectly seared salmon with a lemon butter sauce, roasted vegetables that still had a slight char on their edges, crusty bread with butter that had been shaped into a small rose. "Eat," he said, and there was something raw in his voice now, something that made her look up and meet his eyes again. "Slowly, or you'll make yourself sick." She picked up the fork with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, cut into the salmon, and brought the first bite to her mouth. The flavor exploded across her tongue, salt and fat and richness that her depleted body recognized as salvation. And she couldn't stop the sound that escaped her throat, half sob and half moan. Couldn't stop the tears that finally spilled over and ran down her cheeks as she took another bite and another, trying to obey his instruction to go slowly, but unable to fight the desperate need to fill the emptiness inside her. He watched her eat with an expression she couldn't read, his arms crossed over his chest. And when she'd cleaned the plate, using the bread to soak up every last drop of sauce because wasting even a molecule of this gift would have been sacrilege, he took it from her and replaced it with another. This one pasta in a cream sauce with mushrooms and herbs that tasted like everything good she'd ever imagined but never experienced. "What's your name?" he asked as she ate the second plate more slowly, her stomach finally beginning to signal fullness, the desperate edge of her hunger blunted by his unexpected kindness. "Ilara," she said, and was startled by how rough her voice sounded, how long it had been since she'd spoken her own name out loud. "Ilara," he repeated, testing it, and then after a pause, "I'm Killian. Killian Thornwild. This is my restaurant, my kitchen, and you tried to—" Steal from me. She set down her fork, the brief moment of peace shattered by reality crashing back in. She was a thief, an Omega with no rights, no protection, and he was an Alpha who could destroy her with a single phone call. I know, she said quietly. I'm sorry. I'll leave. You'll stay right there until I figure out what the hell I'm supposed to do with you. He interrupted, and there was frustration in his voice now. Anger maybe, but directed inward rather than at her. Do you have somewhere to go? Family? A pack? She shook her head and watched his jaw clench, watched something that looked almost like pain flash across his face before he locked it down behind the mask of control. The Omega Registry revoked my placement, she said flatly. 3 weeks ago. I'm unregistered now. The kitchen had gone quiet around them, the dinner service winding down, and she could feel the weight of that silence, the significance of what she'd just admitted. Unregistered Omegas had no legal protections, no access to housing or healthcare or employment, existed in a legal gray zone that made them prey for anyone with power and inclination to take advantage. Killian's scent shifted, darkened, and she recognized it with a primal part of her brain that existed beneath conscious thought. Alpha rage. Protective and possessive, and it was directed at a system that had thrown her away like garbage. You'll stay here tonight, he said, and it wasn't a question or an offer, but a statement of fact delivered in a tone that brooked no argument. There's an apartment above the restaurant. It's empty. You'll stay there, and tomorrow we'll... He paused, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture of frustration. Tomorrow we'll figure out what happens next. She wanted to argue, wanted to refuse because accepting help from an Alpha had always come with strings, with expectations, with a price she couldn't afford to pay. But she was so tired, so utterly exhausted by the constant fight to survive, that she just nodded. He led her through the kitchen and up a narrow staircase she hadn't known existed, past the main dining room where a few late diners still lingered over wine and dessert, to a door that opened onto a small but beautiful apartment. Hardwood floors, large windows that looked out over the city, furniture that was simple but well made, and most importantly, clean. Everything clean and safe and warm. The bedroom's through there, Killian said, gesturing to a door on the far wall. Bathroom stocked. There's clothes in the closet from... He stopped, and she saw something pass across his face, grief or memory or both, from before. They should fit. Take whatever you need. She turned to thank him and found him already at the door, his hand on the knob, his body angled away as if he couldn't wait to leave. Killian, she said, and he froze, his shoulders going rigid at the sound of his name in her voice. Why are you doing this? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer, and when he finally did, he still didn't turn to look at her. Because no one should be hungry, he said simply. Because you shouldn't have had to steal to eat. Because the system that put you in that position is broken. And he stopped, shook his head. Get some sleep. Ilara, we'll talk in the morning. She woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the smell of coffee, and for a moment, she thought it had all been a dream, the restaurant, the food. The Alpha who had shown her more kindness in one night than she'd experienced in her entire life. But the clothes she wore were real, soft cotton that had been worn and washed until it felt like a second skin. And when she walked into the main room, she found Killian sitting at the small dining table with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested he hadn't slept at all. Sit, he said, pushing one of the cups toward the empty chair. We need to talk about your options. She sat, wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, and waited. You can't stay unregistered, he began, his voice matter-of-fact, professional, as if they were discussing a business transaction rather than her life. It's too dangerous. You have no legal protections, no access to health care, and if someone reports you, you'll end up in a detention center, and those places are... He stopped, his hands tightening around his own cup. They're worse than the streets. So option 1, you go back to the registry, submit to their requirements, and hope they place you somewhere that isn't hell. Option 2, you bond with an Alpha who can register you as PAC, which gives you legal status and protection, but also means you're bound to them and subject to PAC law, which can be just as bad depending on the Alpha. He paused, took a sip of his coffee, and she watched his throat work as he swallowed. Option 3, you stay here, work in my restaurant, and I register you as PAC. Not bonded, he added quickly, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that stole her breath. Just registered. You'd have your own space, your own income, legal protection, and the freedom to leave whenever you want. The offer hung between them like something fragile and impossible, and she couldn't quite process it. Couldn't understand why this alpha would risk his reputation, his business, his everything for an Omega he'd met less than 12 hours ago. Why? She asked again. The same question from last night, and this time he didn't look away. My sister was Omega, he said quietly, and the past tense hit her like a physical blow. Lydia, she was... His voice caught, and he had to stop, had to breathe, had to fight for control before he could continue. She was beautiful and brilliant, and the registry placed her with an alpha who treated her like property, who broke her piece by piece until there was nothing left but... He couldn't finish. Didn't need to, because she understood what he wasn't saying, understood the guilt and rage and helplessness that drove him to cook for a starving Omega in the middle of a dinner service, to offer safety to a stranger who had tried to steal from him. I couldn't save her, he said, and his voice was rough with grief that time hadn't softened. I couldn't save her because I didn't know, didn't see, didn't fight hard enough or fast enough, and by the time I did, it was too late. So if I can save you, if I can give you a choice that she never had, then maybe... He stopped, shook his head. Maybe it means something. Maybe it makes up for... It doesn't, she said gently, surprising herself with her own boldness. Nothing will make up for losing her, but it means something anyway. It means something to me. They sat in silence for a long moment, the morning light making patterns on the hardwood floor, and then Killian cleared his throat and stood. So, he said, back to business because emotion was too much, too raw. What do you say? Will you stay? She thought about the streets, about hunger that gnawed at your insides until you couldn't think straight, about the cold and the fear and the absolute certainty that she wouldn't survive another winter. She thought about this alpha who cooked like it was prayer and looked at her like she was human, like she mattered, like her choice actually meant something. Yes, she said, I'll stay. The first week was awkward, a careful dance of boundaries and expectations as they learned to exist in each other's orbit. She worked prep in the mornings, chopping vegetables with a precision that Killian corrected with patient instruction, and served as a runner during dinner service, carrying plates from kitchen to table and learning the rhythm of the restaurant's heartbeat. The staff watched her with curiosity tempered by caution, and she felt their questions like weight. Who was she? What was she to their alpha? Why had he given her protection when he'd never shown interest in any Omega before? She kept her head down, worked hard, and tried not to notice the way Killian watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, his gray eyes tracking her movements across the kitchen with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. At night, she returned to the apartment above the restaurant, her apartment now, though it still felt borrowed, temporary, and lay awake listening to the sounds of the city and wondering what it meant that an alpha's scent clung to the clothes she wore, that she'd started anticipating his arrivals before she heard his footsteps, that her Omega biology recognized him in ways her mind tried desperately to ignore. She didn't want to bond, didn't want to belong to anyone, couldn't afford the vulnerability that came with letting someone matter. But Killian was making it hard to remember all the reasons why she should keep her distance, why gratitude shouldn't slip into something more dangerous, more consuming. He brought her coffee every morning, always with cream and sugar, even though she'd never told him how she took it. As if he could read her preferences in the way she moved or breathed or existed in his space. And they'd sit at that small dining table and talk about nothing important. The weather, the menu, a difficult customer from the night before, while underneath the mundane conversation, something else grew, something neither of them acknowledged, but both felt. It was Marcus who finally said what everyone was thinking, cornering her in the walk-in cooler 3 weeks into her employment with a serious expression that made her stomach drop. I've worked for Killian for 5 years, he said without preamble, since he opened this place, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. She busied herself with organizing produce, refusing to meet his eyes. He's just being kind. He's being careful, Marcus corrected. There's a difference. He's watching you like you're about to disappear, like he's afraid that if he looks away too long, you'll vanish. And you? He paused, waiting until she finally looked up. You're watching him the same way. Like he's the first good thing that's ever happened to you, and you don't know what to do with it. She wanted to deny it, wanted to laugh it off, but the words stuck in her throat because they were true, every syllable of them. It doesn't matter, she said instead. He registered me as pack out of guilt over his sister. He's just trying to save someone he couldn't save before. Marcus shook his head slowly, sadly, like she'd disappointed him. If you really believe that, then you're not paying attention. But I'll tell you this, Killian Thornwile doesn't do anything out of guilt. He does things because he chooses to, because he believes they're right, because he cares. And he cares about you, whether you're ready to see it or not. He left her standing there in the cold, surrounded by vegetables and possibility, and when she emerged back into the kitchen's heat, she found Killian at his station, his hands moving through prep work with the practiced ease of someone who'd done these motions 10,000 times. He looked up as she approached, and their eyes met across the stainless steel counters. And she felt it, that pull, that recognition, that sense of something inevitable building between them, whether they wanted it or not. That night, everything changed. She was closing the dining room, wiping down tables while the kitchen staff finished their end-of-shift routines, when the front door opened and 3 alphas walked in, expensive suits, cold eyes, the kind of entitled arrogance that came from never being told no. Sorry, we're closed, she said automatically, straightening from the table she'd been cleaning. The tallest one, a blonde with a sharp smile that didn't reach his eyes, looked her up and down with the kind of assessment that made her skin crawl. That's fine. We're not here to eat. His gaze lingered on her neck, on the spot where a bond mark would be if she'd been claimed, and his smile widened when he found it bare. We're here to make your alpha an offer. Where's Thornwilde? Before she could answer, Killian emerged from the kitchen, Marcus and 2 other staff members at his back, and she watched his entire demeanor shift, the careful gentleness he showed her replaced by something harder, more dangerous, more alpha. Dorian, he said, and the single word carried enough ice to freeze blood. I thought I made it clear last time that you weren't welcome here. Dorian's smile never wavered. That was before I knew you were harboring unregistered Omegas. Or has that changed? His eyes flicked to Alara, and she felt Killian's rage spike, sharp and violent in the air between them. She's registered, Killian said through clenched teeth. Pack Thornwilde. Legal and documented. Interesting, Dorian mused, circling closer to where she stood. Because I ran her scent through the database, and there's no record of any Alara in your pack. In fact, there's no record of you ever having registered an Omega at all. So either the system's wrong, he paused for effect, or you filed false documentation, which is a felony, or, his smile turned predatory, she's unregistered and you're illegally harboring her, which means she's subject to seizure and you're subject to prosecution. The room went silent except for the hum of the refrigerators, and Alara felt her world tilting sideways, felt the safety she'd started to believe in crumbling like sand. Killian stepped between her and Dorian, his body a wall of protection, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, could smell the fury and fear radiating off him in waves. The paperwork was filed 3 weeks ago, he said. If it's not in the system yet, that's a processing delay, not a legal violation. Then you won't mind if I take her to registry headquarters to verify? Dorian said pleasantly. Just temporary custody while we sort out the confusion. I'm sure she'll be back in your... He paused. Loaded the next word with innuendo, care within a few days. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs because she knew what temporary custody meant: detention. Centers where Omegas disappeared into the system, where alphas like Dorian could claim them through loopholes and technicalities, where no one asked questions because Omega lives didn't matter enough to warrant investigation. Killian's hands had curled into fists at his sides, and she could see him calculating odds, weighing options, trying to find a path through this that didn't end with her being taken. She's not going anywhere, he said, and his voice had dropped into a register that resonated in her chest, in her bones, pure alpha command that made the other alphas in the room shift uncomfortably. You want to challenge my claim? Fine. File the formal paperwork. Go through the proper channels. But you're not touching her tonight. Dorian's pleasant mask finally cracked, revealing the cruelty beneath. The proper channels are the ones I own, Thornwild. The registry director is my cousin. The judge who reviews pact disputes is on my payroll. You can't protect her, not through the system, and we both know it. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to give her to me, and in exchange, I won't file charges for false documentation. I'll even throw in a nice settlement, enough to cover any legal fees you might incur from, say a sudden health inspection that finds violations in your kitchen. Your choice, lose the Omega or lose everything. The other alphas with Dorian had moved to flank her, cutting off her escape routes, and she felt panic rising like floodwater, felt her Omega instincts screaming at her to submit, to accept, to not be the reason Killian lost the restaurant he'd built, the dream he'd created in his sister's memory. It's okay, she said quietly, and watched Killian's head snap toward her, watched horror and denial flash across his face. I'll go. No. The word was absolute, unshakable, and when Killian looked back at Dorian, something had changed in his expression, something that made even the other alpha take a step back. You want to play games? Fine, but we're going to play by the old rules, not your corrupt system. I challenge you for her. Single combat, traditional laws, winner takes custody, and the loser drops all claims and charges. The kitchen staff inhaled collectively, and even Dorian looked surprised, then calculating. Single combat was ancient, rarely invoked, but still technically legal. Alphas fighting for stakes too important to trust to courts or paperwork. You'd risk your life for an unregistered Omega you've known for 3 weeks? Dorian asked, and genuine curiosity colored his voice. I'd risk everything, Killian said simply, and his eyes found hers across the space, held her gaze with an intensity that stole her breath. Because she's mine. Not as property, not as possession, but as pack. As responsibility, as someone I chose and who chose me, and no one, not you, not the registry, not the whole damn system, gets to take her. Something cracked open in her chest. Something that had been frozen and locked and protected for so long, she'd forgotten it existed. Hope and terror and the beginning of trust. Dorian studied them both for a long moment, then shrugged. Tomorrow night. The Industrial District, Warehouse 12. Traditional rules, no weapons. Fight until submission or incapacitation. Witnesses required. Bring your pack, I'll bring mine. And Thornwild? He paused at the door, looked back with a smile that promised violence. I hope she's worth dying for. The restaurant emptied quickly after Dorian left, the staff disappearing with worried glances and promises to return tomorrow. And then it was just Ilara and Killian in the silent dining room. The weight of what he'd done settling between them like something physical. You can't fight him, she said, and her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. He's bigger than you, and he trains, and— I know, Killian interrupted quietly. I know exactly what I'm walking into. Then why? The question ripped out of her, desperate and confused. Why would you risk everything? You barely know me. I'm nobody, nothing, just another broken Omega the system threw away. He crossed the space between them in 3 strides and caught her face between his hands, tilting her head up so she had to meet his eyes. And what she saw there made her breath catch. You are not nothing, he said fiercely. You are brave and strong, and you've survived things that would have broken most people. You walked into my kitchen starving and terrified, and instead of begging or breaking, you stood there with stolen food clutched to your chest and said, I'm hungry, like it was a declaration of war against everything that had tried to make you disappear. You are not nothing, Ilara. You're— His voice cracked. You're everything I didn't know I was looking for. She wanted to look away, wanted to retreat behind the walls she'd built to protect herself, but his hands were gentle on her face, and his eyes held hers with a desperate honesty that wouldn't let her hide. What if you lose? She whispered. What if he— Then you run, Killian said. Marcus has money set aside, Papers with a new name, contacts in a city 3 states away. You run and you don't look back, and you live, Ilara. You survive. You find a way to be happy. Promise me. She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. I can't promise that, because if you're gone, She couldn't say it. Couldn't voice the possibility that the first person to ever see her, really see her, might die tomorrow defending her right to exist. He pulled her against his chest, wrapped his arms around her like he could shield her from the world, and she felt his heart hammering against her cheek, fast and fierce and alive. I'm not going to lose, he said into her hair. I can't, because I just found you, and I'm not ready to let you go. I might never be ready. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the empty restaurant while the city moved around them. And when they finally pulled apart, something had shifted between them, something acknowledged and accepted and terrifying in its implications. That night, she didn't go to her apartment. She followed him to his, a space she'd never seen before, all dark wood and leather and the scent of him everywhere. They didn't talk about tomorrow, didn't discuss strategy or odds or possibilities. Instead, he cooked for her again, and she sat at his counter and watched his hands move through familiar motions. And they ate in comfortable silence that said more than words could. When she finally stood to leave, he caught her wrist gently. Stay, he said. Just stay. I'll take the couch. He paused, struggling with vulnerability. I just want to know you're here, that you're safe. She stayed, curled in his bed that smelled like cedar and black pepper, while he kept watch from the living room. And she couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about tomorrow and all the ways this could end, all the futures that hung in the balance of one fight. She heard him moving restlessly through the apartment, heard the quiet sounds of him preparing, not for victory, but for the possibility of loss. And in the hours before dawn, she made a decision. The warehouse was exactly what she'd expected. Abandoned, cavernous, lit by harsh industrial lights that cast stark shadows across the concrete floor where Killian and Dorian would fight. The witnesses had gathered, Dorian's pack on one side, 15 alphas in expensive clothes who watched with predatory interest, and Killian's much smaller group on the other. Just Marcus and 2 other staff members who looked nervous but determined. She stood between them, her hands clenched at her sides, and watched Killian strip off his shirt to reveal the lean muscle beneath. Dorian was bigger, broader, and he smiled when he saw her watching, a smile that promised what would happen after he won. Last chance to back out, Dorian called across the space. Give her up now, and we can all go home. Killian's response was to step into the center of the marked fighting circle, his stance balanced and ready, and Ilara's heart climbed into her throat because she could see it now. How this would go. How Dorian's size and training would wear Killian down. How her alpha would fight until he couldn't anymore. Because that's who he was. The man who couldn't save his sister and would die trying to save her instead. The fight began with a brutal efficiency that stole her breath. Dorian moved like a trained fighter, quick and powerful, landing blows that echoed in the warehouse's emptiness. Killian was faster, more agile, using speed and precision to counter strength, but it wasn't enough. She watched him take a hit to the ribs that made him stagger, watched blood bloom from a split lip, watched the way he kept getting back up, even as it became clear he was outmatched. The fight lasted 17 minutes that felt like hours, 17 minutes of watching the man who'd saved her, who'd chosen her, who'd risked everything for her, get systematically broken down. When Killian finally fell to his knees, blood dripping from his nose and mouth, Dorian standing over him with a victor's smile, Ilara felt something inside her crack wide open, not breaking, but blooming, like a flower that had been waiting years for the right moment to unfurl. She stepped into the circle before anyone could stop her, before she could think about the consequences or the danger. And when Dorian reached for her, she did something she'd never done before, something she hadn't even known she was capable of doing. She released her omega scent full force, not the muted background presence she'd learned to suppress, but everything, all the power and allure and primal magic that had been locked away inside her. Genetic gifts from an omega lineage that went back centuries. The effect was immediate and devastating. Every alpha in the warehouse froze, their instincts hijacked by a scent that spoke directly to the most primitive parts of their brains. But it was Dorian who took the full force of it. Dorian who was close enough to feel the pull, and she watched his pupils dilate, watched his aggressive posture soften into something dazed and confused. "You're not taking him," she said, and her voice was different now, layered with harmonics that made the words bypass conscious thought and sink straight into hindbrain. "You're going to leave. You're going to drop all claims. You're going to forget you ever saw me." It was compulsion. Omega voice in its purest form, a gift so rare that most people thought it was myth, and she'd never used it before because using it meant revealing what she was, not just any Omega, but descended from the royal Omega lines that had once ruled alongside Alphas before the system had been corrupted, before power had been redefined as purely Alpha domain. Dorian stumbled backward, fighting the compulsion, his face twisting with confusion and rage. What are you?" "I'm the Omega your system tried to erase," she said, holding his gaze with a strength she'd discovered only in this moment, only when protecting Killian had become more important than protecting herself. "I'm what you fear most, an Omega who doesn't need your permission to exist, who doesn't need your system to validate her worth. Now leave and don't come back." The compulsion took hold, sinking into Dorian's mind like roots into soil, and she watched him turn mechanically, watched his pack follow with confused expressions, watched them file out of the warehouse like puppets whose strings had been cut. Only when the last of them disappeared did she let the scent fade, let the power recede, and the moment it did, her knees buckled and she would have fallen if Killian hadn't caught her, his arms wrapping around her despite his injuries, holding her up when she couldn't hold herself. "What?" His voice was rough with pain and awe. "What was that? What are you?" She looked up at him, this Alpha who'd given her everything, and for the first time in her life, she told someone the truth. "My grandmother was from the Sylvanus line. Royal Omegas. They could command Alphas with voice alone, could shift the balance of power with a word. The registry found out when I was 12, and they—" Her voice broke. "They suppressed it. Gave me drugs that dampened the gift, told me I was defective, dangerous, that if I ever used it I'd be locked away forever. So I learned to hide it, learned to make myself small and invisible and forgettable. Until tonight. Until you." Killian's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing away the tears she didn't realize were falling. And despite the blood on his lips and the bruises already forming on his ribs, he smiled. "You're magnificent," he said simply, "and you just saved my life." Marcus and the others had gathered around them, shock and wonder on their faces, but it was Marcus who spoke first. "Does this mean, are you—" He paused, struggling with the implications. "Are you actually royalty?" She shook her head. "The royal lines don't exist anymore. The registry dismantled them generations ago, scattered the bloodlines, suppressed the gifts." "You're not just anything," Killian interrupted fiercely. "You're Alara, your pack. You're mine if you want to be, and I'm yours if you'll have me. Not because of bloodlines or power or gifts, but because 3 weeks ago you walked into my kitchen desperate enough to steal. And I looked at you and saw—" He stopped, his voice going rough with emotion. "I saw home. I saw someone worth fighting for. I saw you." The words hung between them, raw and honest and terrifying, and she realized that this was the moment, the choice that would define everything that came after. She could run, could use her newly revealed power to disappear into a new life where no one knew what she was or what she could do. Or she could stay, could choose this Alpha who'd chosen her first, could build something real from the ruins of everything they'd both lost. "I want to stay," she whispered. She took a shaky breath. "I want to be yours. Not as pack registry or legal protection, but as bond, as mate. If you want—" He kissed her before she could finish, his split lip pressing against hers with a gentleness that belied the violence he'd just endured, and she tasted blood and salt and promise. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I want," he said simply. "I want everything. I want mornings and midnights and every moment in between. I want to cook for you and fight for you and build a life where you never have to be afraid again. I want—" His voice cracked. "I want to love you, Ilara, if you'll let me." She nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat, and felt his arms tighten around her, felt the rightness of it settle into her bones like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. The bonding happened 3 days later in the restaurant after closing, with just Marcus and the kitchen staff as witnesses. No registry officials, no formal paperwork, just the two of them and the pack they'd chosen standing in the space where everything had begun. Killian had healed quickly, his alpha biology knitting the damage from the fight, and when he stood before her in the soft light of the dining room, he looked like everything she'd never let herself dream of, strong and gentle, fierce and kind hers. The traditional words were simple, ancient, predating the corrupted system that had tried to control them. He spoke his vow first, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I claim you as mate, as equal, as partner. Your safety is my purpose, your happiness is my goal, your freedom is my gift. I will stand with you, fight for you, and love you until my last breath. Will you accept this bond?" She took his hands, felt the rightness of their palms pressed together, and spoke her own vow. "I claim you as mate, as equal, as partner. Your dreams are my support, your wounds are my healing, your heart is my home. I will stand with you, fight beside you, and love you beyond my last breath. I accept this bond." The mark appeared like magic, where his lips touched her throat, a silvery pattern that looked like frost on winter windows, and she felt it, the snap of connection, the rush of emotion and sensation that came with true bonding. She marked him in return, her own kiss leaving a matching pattern on his neck. And when their eyes met again, they were no longer two separate people, but something new, something stronger than either had been alone. The restaurant thrived. Word spread about the alpha chef who'd fought for his omega mate, about the mysterious power she'd displayed, about the bond that radiated from them like heat from a forge. Customers came for the food, but stayed for the atmosphere, for the sense of something rare and real happening in the kitchen and dining room. Ilara worked beside Killian now, not as assistant but as partner, her own culinary gifts emerging as she learned to trust her instincts. They developed a signature dish together, a complex creation that required both their skills to execute, that tasted like trust in partnership and love made edible. The registry tried to investigate, sent officials with questions about her bloodline and her abilities, but Killian met them at the door with legal documentation that was ironclad and a protective fury that made even bureaucrats think twice. She was bonded, registered, protected by laws older than the corrupt system that had tried to break her, and there was nothing they could do except accept it. Some nights, when the restaurant was closed and they sat together in the apartment where it had all begun, Killian would pull her close and ask her to tell him about her dreams, not the nightmares of her past, but the hopes for her future. And she'd tell him about the cookbook she wanted to write, about teaching other Omegas to cook and claim their own power, about building something that would outlast them both. "We'll do it," he'd say, kissing her temple. "All of it, together." 6 months after the bonding, Ilara stood in the kitchen during a quiet afternoon prep, her hands moving through familiar motions, chopping herbs with the precision Killian had taught her, the knife an extension of her will. Marcus worked at the station beside her, and she caught him smiling. "What?" she asked, looking up. "Just thinking about the first time you walked in here," he said. "Terrified and starving, trying to steal a loaf of bread. And now, look at you, co-owner, bonded mate, teaching classes on weekends. It's like watching a phoenix rise from ashes." She glanced toward the office where Killian was working on orders, could feel him through the bond, content, focused, happy. "I didn't rise alone," she said quietly. "He gave me the space to become who I was supposed to be." "No," Marcus corrected gently. "He gave you safety. You did the rising all on your own. That's the difference between real love and possession. Real love creates space for transformation. He just held the space while you figured out how to fly." That night, after service ended and the staff had gone home, Ilara found Killian in the dining room, standing at the window that looked out over the city. She wrapped her arms around him from behind, pressed her cheek against his back, and felt his hands cover hers. "I was thinking," he said quietly, "about Lydia, about how she'd love what we've built here, How she'd love you. Tell me about her, Alara said, because they danced around his grief for months but never fully walked into it. Tell me who she was. So he did, his voice soft in the darkness, painting a picture of his sister, brilliant and funny, creative and kind. An Omega who dreamed of opening her own bakery but had been broken by a system that saw her only as property. He told her about the guilt he'd carried, the weight of not saving someone he'd loved, the way that guilt had driven him to build this restaurant as a monument to what she should have been able to become. But it's not a monument anymore, he said, turning in her arms to look down at her. Not since you. Now it's something alive, something real. You didn't just save yourself that night. Ilara, you saved me too. She rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and slow, pouring everything she couldn't say into the gesture, gratitude and love, promise and partnership, the absolute certainty that she'd found her home in this alpha's arms. When they pulled apart, she took his hand and led him toward the stairs, toward their apartment, toward the bed they shared, and the life they were building together. Come on, she said, smiling over her shoulder. We have an early morning tomorrow. New menu items to test, remember? He followed her up the stairs. This alpha who'd seen her when she was invisible, who'd fed her when she was starving, who'd fought for her when the world said she wasn't worth fighting for. And as they climbed toward their home, their future, their forever, Alara thought about the girl she'd been 6 months ago, desperate and broken, stealing food to survive, and marveled at the woman she'd become. Not because an alpha had saved her, but because an alpha had given her the space and safety and love to save herself. The restaurant lights dimmed behind them. The city settled into its nighttime rhythm, and somewhere in the darkness, 2 souls who'd found each other against impossible odds held tight and refused to let go. Because that's what real love does. It doesn't erase the past or promise a future without pain, but it stands witness to transformation, celebrates survival, and says, you matter, you're seen, you're home. And in a world that had tried so hard to make her disappear, Ilara had finally found the one thing she'd been searching for all along. Someone who looked at her and saw not a broken Omega or a dangerous secret or a political problem, but simply her. Perfectly, completely, eternally her. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, the bond humming between them like a song, and in the morning, they'd wake up and do it all again, cook and create. Build and dream, love and live. Together, always together.